Welcome to Chapter 10, Adjectivals. Okay, before we talk about adjectivals, let's go back and talk about the necessary components. We talked about this with Chapter 7, Adverbials, what is necessary to make a sentence. And if you remember from Chapter 7, we looked at some examples, right? And in the first example, we said that subject, verb, and object seemed very necessary, right? With the verb see, we really like to have a direct object. If I just said Granny saw, it doesn't feel like a complete sentence, a complete idea. You need to tell me what Granny saw. She saw a gopher. The prepositional phrase in the garden, it tells me where the gopher was, but that seems like less essential information, right? That's extra information, but it's not essential, right? Whereas in the second sentence, Deirdre is eating ramen noodles. Unlike the verb see, we can have the verb eat as an intransitive verb. Yes, it adds meaning. It gives me more information if you add a direct object and you tell me what the person is eating, but the verb eating itself can exist without a direct object. So Deirdre is eating would be a perfectly fine sentence to say. And that direct object is a little less essential than the gopher in the first sentence. And then in the third example, we have a modal, may, right? And that modal seems pretty important if I'm talking about the future, in this case, next semester, right? Not only is some kind of modal necessary for giving me the meaning that this verb is going to happen in the future, but it's also telling me that this is an uncertain future. Unlike the word will or won't, this is may. She may, she might. We're not sure, right? And that removing that modal really is not going to give me a grammatically correct sentence, and it's going to take away some essential meaning. So whether it's a noun phrase operating as a subject or a direct object or the verb itself or a modal, those seem like pretty solid essential pieces of a sentence, right? So again, the necessary components of a sentence, they're going to be that main verb. No verb, no sentence, right? You need a verb. And then we're gonna need a subject for sure, right? Who or what is doing the verb. And then there may be some objects or complements to that main verb. And then there are some modals that may be essential for the sentence to have a grammatically correct sentence. And certain prepositional phrases may be necessary as well. Okay? Certain ones, but not all. Okay? And we saw in chapter 7 that there are a lot of kinds of prepositional phrases that are not necessary. So that extra stuff in the sentence in chapter 7, we looked at adverbials. Adverbials were those adverb phrases, noun phrases, prepositional phrases, infinitive verb phrases, those subordinate clauses. We looked at 5 different types of adverbials. They were all adding extra information about the verb. They weren't essential and necessary to have a grammatically correct, complete sentence in English, but it was extra. Adjectivals are working the same way. They are the extra stuff. They're adding some extra description or meaning, but they're not essential to have a complete sentence. So, whereas adverbs and adverbials were modifying the verb, adjectivals, like adjectives, are modifying nouns, right? So those subjects and objects and complements that were all noun phrases, we can add some adjectivals to those to give some extra information. Okay, so chapter 10, we're looking at adjectivals. Just like adverbials may be adverbs, but not necessarily. Adjectivals may be adjectives, but not necessarily. Okay? So let's review adjectives and adjective phrases. Pause the video now and pick out all of the adjective phrases in these 6 sentences. Okay, and now that you have finished, check your answers. Okay, we see that an adjective phrase may be a single lone adjective, as in the first 2 sentences. We could have 2 or more adjectives, as in the third or the last sentence, right? We could have some qualifiers, like the word very, or very, very good day. You could have 2 or more adjectives combined with a conjunction, like exhausted but triumphant, maybe exhausted and triumphant. So conjunctions like but or and could be in there as well. But these are all phrases with an adjective as the head of the phrase. They're all adjective phrases. Now, let's look at some of these adjective phrases where we have more than one adjective, and pause the video here and add a comma where you think a comma is possible between the adjectives, and then let's look at it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. I hope you did pause the video. Let's check the answers. Okay. In the first sentence, that word prima, meaning one, or the main, the most important ballerina, well, that's really, we consider that very much part of the term prima ballerina, right? So that's kind of almost a compound noun, prima ballerina. And so we don't need a comma between the adjectives angry and prima, right? Just like in the second sentence, the main purpose, right, that adjective main, seems to be performing a different function than the adjective unclear. And so it doesn't really feel like we need a comma between unclear and main. Whereas in the third sentence, tall and dark are both describing the physical appearance of the stranger. So we might put a comma there. Slimy green, maybe. We could put a comma there, but maybe not, right? Slimy is more like the texture of the lizard, whereas green is just the color. Green seems a little more essential to the meaning of the word lizard, so we maybe a comma, maybe not, right? Sad and leafless, again, seems like maybe we could put a comma there. Powerful and charismatic are 2 adjectives kind of describing the nature of the leader, the personality. They're kind of performing the same purpose there. So we could maybe put a comma there. Just like seedy, dilapidated are describing the quality of that old house, but the old is describing the age of the house. And so could we put a comma between dilapidated and old? Maybe we could put a comma there, but it feels like we don't really need to. A wise and strategic decision. Well, strategic seems like it's describing the nature, the kind of decision, whereas wise is making a kind of opinion, giving us an opinion about that. It almost feels like the unclear main purpose, the wise strategic decision. We don't really feel like we need a comma there, right? And then for sure in the last one, I don't feel like we need a comma at all, because the adjective former is definitely a different kind of description than the adjective unrepentant. So unrepentant former thief, again, it doesn't really feel like we need an adjective there. I think probably in all of these, you don't really need a comma because the adjectives phrases are so short. When you have a short adjective phrase with maybe just 2, maybe 3 adjectives, you might be able to get away with no comma. But where we put the comma and when we feel like we don't need a comma. It's a very interesting thought experiment, right? What are those, how, so not all adjectives are equal, right? How is the adjective describing that noun? Is it telling us a physical characteristic, or giving an opinion, or the age, or the color? What's going on there? Okay, so something to think about. Now, adjectivals, okay, may be adjective phrases, as in the last slide, but they don't have to be adjective phrases. They could be adjective clauses, sometimes called relative clauses. So we can see in these three examples, right, the relative clause or the adjective clause always comes after the noun it's describing. Adjective phrases will come before. Like in these examples, right? All of the adjectives come before the noun. Adjective clauses come after the noun. Okay. They're describing that noun or that noun phrase, right? And they're going to start with a relative pronoun. They typically start with a relative pronoun. Who or whom, when you're talking about people. Whose, when you're talking about possession. Which or that, when you're talking about a thing, right? That you can use for things or people. So the car, which car? The car that is blocking the driveway. The dog, which dog? Our dog, right? Who barks at night? Who? For a dog? Okay, I threw that one in there to show you, an example of how people anthropomorphize their dog, right? When you talk about your pet dog, you usually, how many of you have a pet dog or a pet cat? Do you say it or do you say he, she? I think most of us say he or she for your pet, right? So you probably would use the relative pronoun who, if it's your dog, right? A pet. Some other nasty old dog out on the street, probably would say that, or the dog that I see outside on the street. Okay. The CD, which you recommended. So these are all adjective clauses. Okay. I'm going to give you some examples again. Just go along, pause the video if you have to. Which relative pronoun would you put in each sentence? So which sentence would be a who or a whom or whose, a which or that? Okay. And there could be more than one option for these. So the car, right? Our dog, that's CD. John, his neighbor John, okay, or that doctor, okay. Pause the video now. Which relative pronoun could fill in that blank? Okay, let's check the answers. So again, we're looking at relative pronoun out of these five. What do we got? For a car, something, right? You can always use that. Okay, the car that. Probably in conversation, we would use that. Which seems a little more formal. So maybe in formal writing, I throw in there. Okay. Our dog, again, we can say it's an animal, so we could say which, but it's our pet. So I think a lot of people might say who. The CD would be that or which. Okay, we're talking about John's house. It's his house, so we need that possessive, whose. And then the doctor is a person. For people, we can also use that, but we could use who. And in this case, you told me about him, right? You told me about. The doctor is the object, so we can use that object pronoun whom. Of course, I don't think any of us use whom in everyday life. I know I never use it, or speaking or writing. It just seems pretentious. So whom, pretty rare in use. Okay. Now let's look at those commas when we have a relative pronoun, because you saw, if we go back to this page, you see sometimes we have some commas and sometimes we don't. So when do we have a comma or when do we don't? Okay, please remove the car. We have that relative clause, no comma. If I just took that adjective clause out, I'm removing some pretty essential information. And now the person asking me might say, hey, which car? What are you talking about? Okay. Our dog, if I take out that relative clause, well, that possessive our is identifying that dog as our pet dog, Fluffy, or Charles Barkley or something, whatever your dog's name is, Max, right? So that adjective clause there seems like it's not as essential for identifying the dog, which dog we're talking about. Courtney brought that CD. Here, I am going to remove the relative clause. And now, again, I feel like I erased some essential information. Courtney bought that CD. Which CD? What CD are you talking about? Okay, I've removed the identifying information. Okay. Now this relative clause, again, if I removed that, it's not essential for identifying the subject. John, I have his name, and I've identified it as his neighbor, so I already know the subject who we're talking about. That clause seems like it's adding some extra information. Okay. But here we have that I made a point with that doctor. I don't have the doctor's name. So, or I don't have a possessive like your doctor, Dr. Johnston or whatever. So I feel like I need that relative clause to identify which doctor I'm talking about. If I take it off, again, it seems like I'm missing some very essential information. Okay, so we have these two kinds of relative clauses, essential or non-essential. Essential clauses are necessary to identify, hey, which doctor are you talking about? Which CD? What's going on? Which car? Without that essential clause, I don't know which car or which CD or which doctor you're talking about. Non-essential relative clauses, well, they're just adding that extra information for me, right? They're not really necessary to identify. So again, please remove the car. That is essential, right? Whereas our dog, which barks all night, would be non-essential, right? So I can remove that non-essential clause. I don't need it, and I still know who the dog is. And that's why those commas show up. Commas are marking the non-essential clause. Courtney bought that CD. I need it, right? So I don't have a comma. His neighbor John, though, I can remove that relative clause about John's house. So it's non-essential. So again, we see when it's a non-essential clause, those commas show up to mark it as non-essential. Okay. Now I made an appointment with that doctor. There's no comma here because this is not extra information. This is essential information. I need this relative clause to identify the doctor you're talking about. Okay, so non-essential clauses, we put commas around them to mark for the reader to know, hey, this is just extra information, right? It's not necessary. I'm just throwing in a little extra information. We've been talking about this grammatical necessity for 2 chapters now. What is non-essential? What is essential? What is extra information? Okay. So relative clauses that are essential, we looked at a few, right? If it's an object like the car, I can use the pronoun that or which. Okay. If I have a subject like you recommended, I don't need a relative pronoun at all. I can just say, Courtney bought that CD you recommended. And in everyday speech, we usually drop that relative pronoun. But I can put a relative pronoun, that or which, again, for objects. Okay. If it's a person, and that person is the object, you told me about him, then it would be, you told me about whom. I could put that whom in there, but no one talks like that. No one uses whom. So it's a person. We usually use who or that. Okay, so different relative pronouns for essential clauses. And the last one, just like the CD you recommended, we can drop the relative pronoun. I made an appointment with that doctor you told me about. We don't need the relative pronoun there. Okay. So non-essential, again, if it's a non-essential clause, sometimes you'll see it referred to as non-restrictive clause. Those are those ones that are just extra information. I could remove that relative pronoun and it wouldn't really affect the meaning of the sentence, right? I've identified my father, so you know who I'm talking about because it has that possessive my. I don't need an adjective clause or relative clause to identify my father. I say my father, okay? So, comma, who is an engineer, comma. Okay? I, in this case, cannot use the relative pronoun that, right? For non-essential clauses, if it's a person, I need who or whom, right? So in this case, that would be incorrect, okay? Unless you had more than one father. Okay, if you have more than one father, then it might be essential to identify which father you're talking about. And in this day and age, you might have two fathers, okay? So then, but in general, it's not going to be essential. If you only have one father, then it's a non-essential clause, okay? In this second example, we see that the relative clause, it's not essential. We've got that comma there, so we can say which, because it's a CD. Again, we're not going to use that. That only works if it's an essential clause, right? If that adjective clause is necessary to identify the CD you're talking about. If it's non-essential, we have that comma, which. Okay, the president. Okay, if I'm in the United States and you understand I'm talking about the president of the United States, there's only one president, so there's no, right? There's no issue here with adding, there's no reason to add an adjective clause or a relative clause to identify which president are you talking about? I don't know. Okay. Now, if we were having a discussion about different presidents throughout history, then you might need to identify which president. But if we're talking about current events, and I mentioned the president, you know I'm talking about the person who's president right now, right? So any adjective clause after that, like these examples, are non-essential information. They're just giving me some extra information about something about the president. So you can have whom or who, and again, you will not use the pronoun that. So that is only used for essential clauses when that information is necessary. As soon as I'm putting those commas around, right, in front of or around the clause, I need a who, whom, or a which. Right? I can't use that. So go ahead, pause the video now, and decide if the adjective clause is essential. Is it necessary to identify the noun, or is it just providing some extra information? If it's essential, no comma. If it's non-essential, I'm going to put a comma or commas somewhere. Okay? All right. I hope you actually paused the video to look at these. Now let's check your answers. Okay. So in the second sentence, my only sister, I only have one sister, so I don't need an adjective clause to describe, to identify my sister. That adjective clause, who loves sushi, who loves to eat sushi, just an extra information. I put commas around it. The moon, there's only one moon. If I'm talking about the moon, you know which moon I'm talking about, so I don't need an adjective clause to describe or identify the moon. So that's just extra information. I put some commas around it. In the next example, the new schedule. If I just said the schedule, you might say which schedule? There's more than one schedule. This is the new schedule, so I've identified it. So I don't need an adjective clause, right, to identify which schedule. And probably you can assume we're at work or school or the office. There's probably only one schedule to begin with, right? That's the schedule. And in the last example, I use that possessive my. It's my house, right? I've identified the house as mine. So the adjective clause that follows is non-essential, just adding some extra information about my house, okay? In the first example and in the fourth and fifth example, right? If we took out that adjective clause, you would remove some essential identifying information. So in the first sentence, if I took out the clause, you would ask, who did the police capture? Which subject? Who are we talking about, right? In the fourth example, that tweet, which tweet? I'm on this, it's X now. I'm on X, Twitter, right? Every day I have 1 million tweets. Which tweet are you talking about? I need to identify that tweet, right? And then enemy combatants, we're not going to shoot every enemy combatant, right? So but we will shoot it if you cross the border. So we need to identify which enemy combatants are we going to shoot. We're not crazy here. We're not going to shoot everybody. But if you cross the border, you will be shot. So enemy combatants who cross the border, that's an essential clause there. So we don't put a comma. Okay, if we look at the structure of these adjectivals, if we're going to draw a diagram, okay, I give you a sentence like this. First, you would want to identify all of the parts of speech. So go ahead, do that now. Pause the video and identify the part of speech or the word class of each individual word in this sentence. And let's check your answers. Okay. The is a determiner. Parking lots, I just put as one noun. Compound noun. That, again, that is not a determiner here. It is a relative pronoun. It is standing in the, what is that? What is that referring to? That is referring to the parking lots. Okay. Are is a verb. Near is a preposition. Noun, verb, adverb. Okay. So please pay attention and be very careful. When you have an adjective phrase, the word that is a relative pronoun. It's beginning that relative clause. As opposed to the second example, that parking lot flooded yesterday. That is a demonstrative, which is a form of determiner. So notice that is like this, these, those. It's a demonstrative. It comes before a noun, right? That parking lot, that man over there, right? That book, that movie. That's a determiner. It comes before a noun. The parking lots that are near campus, okay, notice what follows is not a noun. We have a verb and a prepositional phrase. We have a relative clause. So that is a relative pronoun. So if you have a sentence like this, you need to identify that as a pronoun. There is a link on Moodle that goes over all of the pronouns in English, including these relative pronouns, that, who, whom, which, and whose. Okay, they're pronouns. Be careful with that.